Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the most incredible stories of World War II, the Dunkirk evacuation. It's a tale of total disaster, of sheer desperation, and somehow of an almost unbelievable deliverance. And it really all boils down to this one number, 338,226. That's how many Allied soldiers were pulled from the very jaws of the German army back in 1940. It was called a miracle, and it was. But to really get how this happened, you first have to understand the absolutely hopeless trap they were in. All right, we're going to break this down into 5 parts. First, we'll see how the Allied armies got pinned against the English Channel. Then we'll look at a really mysterious German order that gave them a sliver of a chance. After that, the incredible rescue mission itself. Then we'll cover the absolutely staggering cost of this escape. And finally, we'll wrestle with the big question of Dunkirk. Was it a disaster or was it a deliverance? Okay, so let's set the stage. How on earth did the entire British Army, plus hundreds of thousands of French and Belgian troops, find themselves completely surrounded, with their backs literally against the ocean? Well, it all comes down to this brilliant, incredibly daring German plan called the Sichelschnitt, or sickle cut. You see, the Allies were expecting the main German attack to come through central Belgium, just like in World War I. They thought that dense Ardennes forest to the south was basically impassable for tanks, and boy were they wrong. German panzer divisions just poured through the Ardennes, went right around France's famous Maginot Line, and made a mad dash for the coast. The speed was just stunning. By May 21st, they'd hit the English Channel, slicing the Allied forces clean in two. The British Expeditionary Force, along with their French and Belgian allies, were suddenly caught. They were trapped in a pocket that was getting smaller and smaller by the hour. Their only way out was the sea. But right then, just as the German tanks were getting ready to deliver the final, crushing blow, the German High Command did something totally bizarre, something historians are still arguing about. On May 24th, an order came down from the top. The tanks were to stop. I mean, this is baffling, right? The German armored columns were just a few miles from Dunkirk, the last port of escape. Why in the world would they just stop? Well, there's no easy answer. A few big theories are still debated. Some say it was practical. The German commanders were worried their precious tanks would get stuck in the marshy, canal-filled land around Dunkirk. Others think Hitler himself got nervous and wanted to save his panzers for the big fight for Paris. And then there's the ego. The head of the German Air Force, Hermann Göring, basically bragged to Hitler that his Luftwaffe could wipe out the trapped armies all by itself. Whatever the real reason, that 2-day pause, that was the miracle. It was the window the Allies desperately needed. And they did not waste a second of it. With the German tanks sitting idle, the British launched one of the most incredible seat-of-your-pants rescue missions in history, Operation Dynamo. Now, the operation started off pretty slow. As you can see on day 1, they only got about 7,600 men out. But the whole thing ramped up incredibly fast. I mean, just look at the jump by day 4, over 47,000 men rescued. And then the peak on day 6 with more than 68,000 soldiers pulled out in just 24 hours. It was a chaotic, desperate race against time, all while German planes were bombing them relentlessly. And the fleet that did the rescuing? It was a truly wild mix. On one hand, you had the professional Royal Navy, destroyers, warships, doing the heavy lifting. But the real legends were the little ships. We're talking hundreds of civilian boats, fishing boats, fancy yachts, river ferries, lifeboats, you name it. If it could float, it was called up to go pluck soldiers off the beaches and shuttle them out to the bigger ships. The scene on the beaches was just organized chaos. The harbor itself was getting pounded by bombs, so these 2 long concrete piers, called moles, became the main loading docks. You had thousands of men lining up for hours on these narrow walkways. Out on the beaches, long winding lines of soldiers snaked out into the cold ocean, standing shoulder-deep in the water, just waiting patiently for a small boat to reach them, all while trying to dodge enemy fire from the sky. But this miracle of deliverance came at a truly staggering price. Sure, the men were saved, but pretty much everything they needed to fight a war was left behind, leaving the British Army a shadow of its former self. First, you have the human cost. Over the course of that whole campaign in France, the British Army suffered 68,000 casualties. Think about it this way. For every 7 guys who got on a boat at Dunkirk, 1 man was either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. And then there's the equipment. To get the soldiers out, the Army lost its punch.
They left behind nearly 2,500 heavy artillery guns. This basically left Britain defenseless against the invasion that everyone thought was coming next.
It also lost its legs. 65,000 vehicles, trucks, motorcycles, transports. The entire logistical backbone of a modern fighting force just left abandoned on the roads of France. And maybe most important of all, it lost its armor. Almost every single British tank in France, 445 of them, was either knocked out in battle or just left behind during the retreat. And even the rescuers paid a heavy, heavy price. Over 200 Allied ships were sunk. That includes 6 British destroyers and 3 French ones, the very warships that were desperately needed to defend the coast from that expected invasion. So this brings us to the big, crucial question. How should we think about Dunkirk? It's a massive contradiction, a paradox that Winston Churchill himself understood perfectly. On one hand, Churchill didn't pull any punches. He called it a colossal military disaster. He knew Britain had just suffered a catastrophic defeat. He said the whole root and core and brain of the British Army had been trapped and almost wiped out. And he immediately warned everybody back home not to start celebrating. In his famous speech, he was crystal clear about it. He said, "We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations. This wasn't a win. This was just avoiding an even more complete and total loss." But, and this is the crucial but, while all the gear was lost, the men were saved. And that was everything. Those 338,000 experienced British and French soldiers who got off those boats, they became the battle-hardened core of a new army, an army that would spend the next 4 years training, re-equipping, and eventually returning to France on D-Day to free Europe. And that leaves us with the ultimate paradox of Dunkirk. It was a humiliating retreat, no doubt about it, a disaster on an epic scale. But by saving its most precious asset, its trained soldiers, from the wreckage, did Britain actually sow the seeds for its own survival and for ultimate victory? The question isn't just whether it was a disaster or a deliverance, but whether it had to be a disaster in order to become a deliverance.